A millionaire invited a gardener to a party at his mansion to humiliate him. What the gardener did left him on his knees in front of the guests. Mark's day started the same way it always did, early. The soft light of dawn barely crept over the hills of Beverly Hills, casting long shadows over the sprawling mansions that lined the streets. But Mark, as always, was already up. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs, and adjusted his worn-out cap before heading towards the grandest house on the street, the Hartman estate. The mansion was a thing of beauty, no doubt about that. Towering pillars, wide terraces, and perfectly maintained hedges that lined the driveway like soldiers standing at attention. It was the kind of place you only saw in movies, the kind where wealth wasn't just shown, it was flaunted. And Mark, with his calloused hands and faded jeans, was the man responsible for making sure the gardens looked perfect year-round. It wasn't that Mark resented his work. In fact, he found peace in the simplicity of it. There was something honest about shaping the earth with his hands, about nurturing something beautiful out of the soil. The plants didn't care about wealth or status, they just needed care and patience, but not everyone saw it that way. William Hartman, the owner of the estate, was a different breed. He had everything: money, power, influence, and he made sure everyone knew it. To William, life was a game, and he always played to win. Unfortunately for Mark, people like him were nothing more than pawns on the board. Mark often found himself on the receiving end of William's cruel jokes. "Hey, Mark," William would call out, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "You ever think about upgrading those old jeans? Might get you a date." And the laughter from William's friends would follow, echoing through the lush gardens. Mark never took the bait. He'd just smile, nod, and continue working. He wasn't the type to retaliate, not with words at least. He believed in keeping his head down, doing his job, and not letting people like William get under his skin. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Every comment, every snicker chipped away at his pride just a little bit more. Still, Mark kept his composure, because, deep down, he knew something William didn't. Patience had its rewards. As he clipped the last of the rose bushes, Mark noticed a sleek, black car pull up to the front of the house. Out stepped William, dressed in his usual designer suit, sunglasses perched on his perfectly tanned face. He was surrounded by a group of equally polished men, all of them laughing at something William had said. Mark gave a brief nod as William passed by, but William barely acknowledged him, just a quick glance before he returned to his conversation. It was always like that. To William, Mark was invisible unless he was the punchline to some joke. Today, though, something felt different. There was a kind of electric tension in the air, and Mark could sense it. William was planning something, and Mark could tell it wasn't going to be good. Later that morning, as Mark finished up trimming the hedges, William approached him with a smug smile. "Mark, my man," he began, clapping a hand on Mark's shoulder with just a little too much force. "Big party at the house tomorrow night. It's going to be the event of the year, and guess what? You're invited." Mark blinked, surprised. William had never invited him to anything before. "Really?" he asked, trying to mask the suspicion in his voice. Yeah, why not? You deserve a night off, don't you?" William's grin widened, but there was something about the way he said it that made Mark's skin prickle. "Dress your best. You're going to be the guest of honor." There it was, the trap. Mark could hear it in William's tone, the mocking undercurrent that lay beneath the surface. This wasn't an invitation. It was an opportunity for William to put him on display, to turn him into a spectacle for his rich friends to laugh at. Mark hesitated for a moment, but then, with his usual calm, he simply nodded. "I'll be there." William's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Good, don't be late." As William walked away, the laughter of his friends fading into the background, Mark stood in silence, watching him go. He knew exactly what was coming, but for some reason, this time felt different. There was a quiet resolve building inside him. Maybe it was time to stop taking things lying down. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be the day William Hartman got a taste of his own medicine. The sun was starting to climb higher in the sky, and the soft morning light had given way to the heat of midday. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow and gathered his tools. As he walked back towards the shed, the quiet determination settled deeper into his bones. Tomorrow was going to be a long night, but something told him it was also going to be one to remember. The day after the unexpected invitation, the Hartman estate buzzed with activity. Everywhere Mark looked, workers hustled to prepare the grounds for the grand event. Massive flower arrangements were being set in place, lights strung across the wide terraces, and the catering staff busily unloaded cases of champagne and trays of hors d'oeuvres from black SUVs. Mark kept his distance from the chaos, focusing on his usual tasks, but there was no escaping the tension in the air. This wasn't just any party. This was the event. The kind of gathering where every guest was someone, and where simply being seen could open doors in the highest circles. William Hartman knew how to put on a show, and this time, Mark suspected, he was planning to make him part of the spectacle. As Mark worked on trimming the last of the hedges by the fountain, he overheard snippets of conversation between the event planners and staff. "The guest list is insane this year," one of them whispered. "Politicians, actors, CEOs, everyone who's anyone is coming." "Of course," another responded, a smirk in her voice. "William wouldn't settle for less. This party has to top last year's disaster." Mark raised an eyebrow. Disaster? He hadn't been aware of any major issues at last year's party. But then again, he wasn't part of that world. He existed on the fringes of it, maintaining the backdrop for the lives of the rich and powerful. Still, it was hard not to be curious. A few hours later, William himself emerged from the house, barking orders into his phone. He was dressed casually in a crisp white shirt and designer sunglasses, but his tone was all business. "No, no, no." William snapped at someone on the other end of the line. "I don't care what it costs. I want it done right. This has to be perfect. My reputation's on the line here." Mark watched from the corner of his eye, careful to avoid drawing attention to himself. But just as he bent down to pick up a stray branch, William turned and caught sight of him. "Mark!" William called out, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Ready for tomorrow night?" Mark straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, I'll be there." William chuckled, that same smug look on his face that Mark had grown used to. "Good. I hope you're planning on bringing your A game. You're going to be in the spotlight." Mark kept his expression neutral, but inside, his suspicions solidified. This wasn't just a party for William to show off his wealth and connections. This was a setup, a chance to put Mark on display, to humiliate him in front of the most powerful people William knew. "I'll be ready," Mark said calmly, meeting William's gaze with a quiet confidence that seemed to take the millionaire by surprise. William hesitated for a split second before flashing a grin. "That's the spirit," he said, clapping Mark on the shoulder. "Just remember, it's all in good fun." As William walked away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's party was going to be more than just a game. He had seen it before, how people like William treated those beneath them as nothing more than entertainment. But Mark wasn't interested in playing the fool. He spent the rest of the day quietly observing the preparations. The staff brought in towering ice sculptures, a live band set up on the back lawn, and rows of sleek cars lined the driveway. The entire estate was transformed into a dazzling display of wealth and extravagance, every detail designed to impress. By the time the sun began to set, the mansion glittered under the lights, ready to welcome its elite guests. Mark, after finishing his duties, made his way back to his small shed near the edge of the property. He could hear the distant sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the house as William's inner circle gathered early for dinner. Mark sat down on a bench outside the shed, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, and let the quiet settle around him. Tomorrow, he knew, would be a turning point. William had every intention of making Mark a spectacle. But what William didn't realize was that Mark wasn't planning on staying quiet this time. For too long, he had listened to the taunts and the condescension, biting his tongue and letting the insults slide. But something had shifted in him. tomorrow he would step into that mansion, not as a servant or a joke, but as someone who had seen everything, and someone who was no longer willing to stay in the shadows. The next day arrived faster than Mark had anticipated. As the sun broke over Beverly Hills, casting long golden rays over the Hartman estate, Mark was already on the grounds, going through his usual routine. There was a strange calm in the air, but beneath it, Mark could feel the tension building. Today was the day of the party, and the day when William would undoubtedly try to make him the centerpiece of some humiliating spectacle. Throughout the morning, various workers and caterers were arriving, putting the final touches on what was sure to be an unforgettable event. Mark kept his head down, trimming hedges and pruning roses, but he couldn't escape the buzz of excitement around him. This wasn't just another party. It was the kind of event people would talk about for weeks, and Mark was being dragged into it whether he liked it or not. As Mark carefully pruned the last of the rose bushes, a voice broke through the air, cutting into his thoughts. "Hey, Mark!" William's voice rang out from the terrace, casual but carrying that familiar edge. "Got a minute?" Mark straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and turned to face William, who was descending the stone steps toward him. Dressed in a sleek, expensive suit that looked like it cost more than Mark made in a month, William strode over with a wide grin plastered on his face. "You're not backing out on me, are you?" William asked, his tone teasing but with a hint of something else, a challenge. Mark kept his expression calm. "Wouldn't dream of it." William laughed, as if the idea that Mark might actually refuse was ridiculous. "Good man," he said, patting Mark on the shoulder with just a bit too much enthusiasm. "I've been telling everyone you're coming. They can't wait to meet you." Mark felt the weight of those words, the underlying message clear as day. William wasn't just inviting him to the party. He was setting Mark up to be laughed at, to be mocked in front of all the rich and powerful guests. "You've got your suit ready, right?" William asked, smirking. "I mean, you're going to need to look the part tonight." Mark smiled politely. "Don't worry, I've got it covered." In truth, Mark didn't have a fancy suit. He didn't need one. His plan wasn't to fit in with William's crowd, but to stand apart from them in a way they'd never see coming. William gave him one last pat on the shoulder before heading back toward the house. "I'm serious, Mark. I'm counting on you to make an impression tonight." Mark watched him go, the smugness practically radiating off of him. He wasn't sure what William had planned, but he knew it would be designed to make Mark look small, insignificant, and foolish. It was a game William loved to play, using people's vulnerabilities against them. But what William didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that Mark wasn't the same quiet, submissive guy he had always been. As the day went on, the preparations for the party ramped up. The estate was transformed into a glittering paradise of wealth and opulence. Rows of sleek cars lined the driveway, and the staff hurried about, making sure every detail was perfect. Mark, meanwhile, finished his work for the day and quietly left the grounds to prepare for what was sure to be an unforgettable night. Back at his small apartment, Mark sat in front of his modest closet. No designer suits hung there. No expensive shoes waited to be polished. But none of that mattered. He wasn't interested in playing by William's rules. Mark reached for the one decent shirt he owned, a simple white button-down, clean but plain, and laid it on the bed. He wasn't going to win this game by dressing up and pretending to be someone he wasn't. The truth would be his armor. As the sun began to set, casting the city in hues of orange and pink, Mark stood in front of his small bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Tonight, things were going to change. William Hartman had played his games for too long, and tonight, Mark was going to remind him that not everyone could be bought or controlled. Just before he left his apartment, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a text from one of his coworkers, a fellow gardener who'd heard about the party. "Good luck tonight, Mark. You know how these people can be." Mark smiled at the message, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing that luck wasn't what he needed tonight. he had something far more powerful on his side: the truth. By the time Mark arrived back at the Hartman estate, the party was already in full swing. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music filled the air as he made his way up the long driveway. He could see the guests milling about in their designer clothes, sipping champagne and engaging in the kind of shallow conversations that were typical at these events. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. As he approached the grand entrance, he saw William at the top of the steps, surrounded by his friends, all of them laughing and looking down at the arriving guests. William spotted Mark and gave him a knowing smile. "There he is," William called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The man of the hour." The laughter that followed was enough to make Mark's stomach tighten, but he kept his face calm, his steps steady. This wasn't going to be the night William had planned, not by a long shot. The Hartman mansion glittered under the soft glow of hundreds of strategically placed lights. It looked like a palace, with guests pouring in through the grand entrance, their conversations and laughter rising above the sound of classical music playing from a live quartet. The entire estate felt alive with a pulse of wealth, the kind that only a select few could truly understand. And in the middle of it all, Mark quietly slipped through the front doors, unnoticed at first by the sea of glamorous people. As Mark stepped into the grand foyer, the full weight of the evening hit him. The marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers, and every corner of the room seemed to be dripping in luxury, from the delicate floral arrangements to the polished silver platters carried by the waitstaff. It was the kind of place that made you feel small if you didn't belong. But Mark wasn't here to fit in. He wasn't here to pretend. He had a job to do, and it wasn't trimming hedges tonight. He scanned the room, catching glimpses of William's friends, CEOs, actors, and a few faces Mark vaguely recognized from magazines. They were all here to celebrate William and, unknowingly, to witness something far more memorable. "Mark!" William's voice rang out from across the room, louder than it needed to be. Mark turned just in time to see him approaching with a drink in hand, his signature smirk in place. "There he is, folks," William continued, addressing the small group of guests around him. "The hardest working man in Beverly Hills." A few chuckles followed, and Mark felt the familiar burn of being the subject of a joke, but he kept his expression neutral, nodding politely as William clapped him on the back. "I was just telling everyone," William said, turning toward the group, "how this guy single-handedly keeps my gardens looking like a masterpiece. Isn't that right, Mark?" Mark could feel the eyes on him, some curious, others amused, but he refused to let them see any hint of discomfort. He gave a small nod, his calm demeanor unwavering. "That's right, just doing my job." William grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. "Well, tonight you get a break. No pruning or digging for you, my friend. Tonight, you're one of us." More chuckles. Mark smiled, but inside, the words sat heavy. William wasn't offering him any real respect. He was making Mark part of the entertainment. One of the women in the group, a tall blonde with expensive jewelry that caught the light, tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "So, Mark, what's it like working for William?" she asked, her voice sweet but with an undertone of mockery. Mark met her gaze steadily. "It's been interesting," he said, his voice calm. "You see a lot when you work in the background." William's smirk flickered just slightly, but he quickly recovered, laughing as though Mark had made a clever joke. "Oh, come on, Mark. Don't hold back. Tell them some of the real dirt," William said, his grin widening. "I'm sure you've seen some pretty crazy stuff around here, right?" The group leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued. They were hungry for gossip, something scandalous to spice up their evening, and William, ever the showman, was more than happy to serve Mark up as the source of it. Mark smiled faintly, his eyes scanning the crowd that had started to gather. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly, "what you learn when people forget you're there." William let out another laugh, though this one seemed a little forced. "Oh, I bet. Come on, give us something. We're all friends here, right?" Mark paused, feeling the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This was it, the moment where William expected him to play the fool, to share some amusing little tidbit about the household or its staff, something harmless that would make the guests laugh and further cement William's control over the evening. But that wasn't what was going to happen. Mark's smile didn't fade as he glanced over at William, locking eyes with him for a brief second. "You want a story?" he asked, his tone light but with a sharp edge beneath it. William grinned, not sensing the shift. "Absolutely." Mark turned slightly, addressing the crowd now, his voice steady and calm. "Well, I'll tell you one thing. Working for William has definitely been an education. You learn a lot about people, especially when they don't think you're paying attention." The group was listening now, the playful energy shifting to something more focused. William still looked amused, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, like he could sense that things weren't quite going the way he'd planned. "For example," Mark continued, his gaze moving across the faces of the wealthy guests, "you learn about how people make their money. Not just the glamorous side you see in the magazines, but the deals that happen behind closed doors, the ones that aren't exactly legal." There was a slight ripple of murmurs through the crowd, the laughter fading as the words settled in. William's smile froze, and for the first time that night, his carefully crafted mask began to slip. "Mark," William said, his voice still light, but there was a tightness to it now. "Let's not get carried away." But Mark wasn't stopping. "You also learn about what people are willing to do to keep their secrets hidden, who they betray, who they manipulate, all to stay on top." The room had gone eerily quiet now. The guests, once amused, were now shifting uncomfortably, sensing the tension growing between Mark and William. But no one spoke, all of them too intrigued by what Mark was going to say next. William's smile had vanished completely. "I think that's enough, Mark," he said, his voice low and controlled. But Mark simply smiled back. "You wanted a story. I'm just giving you one." And with that, the night shifted. The laughter that had filled the air moments before was replaced with something heavier. The feeling that something very real, very dangerous, was about to be exposed. The room, once full of laughter and the clink of champagne glasses, had turned silent. Every eye was on Mark now, and he felt the weight of their collective gaze. The tension was palpable, thick in the air, and William's confident smile had all but disappeared. His usual swagger was replaced by a growing sense of dread, though he was doing his best to hide it. Mark, standing in the middle of the opulent room, remained calm. His face betrayed no emotion, but inside he felt a strange sense of power, a shift in the balance between him and William. For the first time, Mark was the one in control. William cleared his throat, attempting to regain the upper hand. "Mark," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be, all right?" But Mark wasn't finished. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. "Oh, I'm just getting started," Mark replied, his voice steady but carrying a weight that caused the guests to exchange uneasy glances. He took a step forward, meeting William's gaze with a calm intensity. "You see, William, people like you think you're untouchable. You think because you have money and power, that no one can see the dirt hiding just below the surface." William shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. The guests, once so eager for gossip and entertainment, were now looking at each other, unsure of what to do or say. The discomfort in the air was thick, and for the first time in years, William wasn't the center of attention in the way he wanted to be. Mark continued, his voice growing firmer. "I've worked for you for years. I've seen everything. The affairs, the bribes, the shady business deals. You think no one notices because we're just the help, invisible to people like you. But the truth is, we see everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some guests leaning in closer, while others shifted uncomfortably, casting sideways glances at William. The blonde woman who had earlier asked Mark about his work was no longer smiling, her face tight with concern as she realized the gravity of what was happening. "Mark," William said through gritted teeth, his voice barely hiding the panic. "This isn't the time or place." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but it is. You wanted to make me part of your little show tonight, right? Well, here I am." He paused, scanning the faces of the guests. "Let me tell you all a little something about your gracious host." William stepped forward, attempting to regain control. But Mark wasn't backing down. With a calmness that only years of being overlooked could create, he began to unravel the threads of William's carefully constructed life. "Let's start with the business deals," Mark said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "The contracts you've won by bribing officials, the backdoor deals you've made to keep your competitors out of the game. Oh, and let's not forget the offshore accounts, the ones you used to hide the money you've skimmed off those deals." William's face turned pale, the color draining from his skin as the truth began to spill out in front of everyone he cared about impressing. The guests, once enamored with William's charm and wealth, were now whispering to each other in hushed tones, their admiration turning to suspicion. "And then," Mark continued, his voice growing stronger with every word, "there's the personal side of things. The affairs you've had behind your wife's back, the mistresses you've paid off to keep quiet, all while parading around as the perfect family man." The whispers grew louder now, and William's composure was slipping fast. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw tightened as he fought to keep control. But it was clear that things were spiraling out of his grasp. "That's enough!" William finally snapped, his voice harsh and desperate. "You've made your point, Mark. This isn't funny anymore." Mark tilted his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm not trying to be funny, William. I'm just telling the truth." The crowd was fully invested now, eyes wide as they watched the downfall of one of the wealthiest men in Beverly Hills unfold before them. It was a spectacle unlike any they had ever seen, and the energy in the room had shifted from amusement to shock. William took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin me? I'll bury you. You're nothing, Mark. Nothing." Mark stood his ground, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Maybe I was nothing to you, William," he said quietly. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You never saw me. You never saw any of us. The people who work for you. The people you step on to get ahead. You've been so blinded by your own arrogance that you never stop to think that maybe, just maybe, the people you consider beneath you know more than you think." William opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But all he found were cold stares and murmured accusations. His empire, the carefully curated life he had built, was crumbling in front of his eyes. Mark took a step back, surveying the damage he had done. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. The truth had been enough. William was defeated, and everyone in the room knew it. "I'm done," Mark said, turning toward the door. "Enjoy the rest of your night." And with that, he walked away, leaving William standing in the middle of the room, humiliated and exposed. The laughter, the applause, the admiration, all of it had vanished. In its place, there was only silence. As Mark exited the grand mansion, stepping out into the cool night air, he felt lighter. He had spent years working in the shadows, quietly enduring the disrespect of men like William. But tonight, he had taken back his power. The party, meant to celebrate William's dominance, had instead marked the beginning of his downfall. Mark didn't look back as he left the mansion, but he didn't need to. He knew the damage was done. The murmurs and whispers that followed him as he walked through the crowd told him everything. William Hartman's empire, built on lies and deceit, had begun to crumble, and Mark had lit the match. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders that had been there for years. For so long, he had endured the jokes, the disrespect, the feeling of being invisible. But now, for the first time, he felt seen. He had faced William, spoken his truth, and walked away with his dignity intact. The party behind him continued in uneasy silence. The guests, once enamored by William's charm and wealth, were left reeling from Mark's revelations. The lavish setting, the flowing champagne, the glittering chandeliers, none of it could mask the fact that the man at the center of it all had been exposed. And in Beverly Hills, a scandal like this didn't stay quiet for long. Inside the mansion, William stood frozen in the center of the room, his face pale and his hands trembling at his sides. The confidence he'd once carried so effortlessly had evaporated. The crowd that had once been his adoring audience now looked at him with a mixture of shock, pity, and judgment. He could feel the stares, hear the whispered conversations. His carefully curated reputation, the facade he'd spent years building, was shattered. A few of his closest friends, or at least the people he thought were his friends, stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "William," one of them said hesitantly, "is there any truth to what he said?" William's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, for some way to explain away the bombshells that Mark had dropped. But there was no quick escape, no easy denial. The truth was out, and the consequences were unfolding before him. "It's nothing," William muttered, but his voice lacked the usual force and conviction. "Mark's just trying to get back at me. It's ridiculous." But the murmurs only grew louder, the questions more insistent. The guests weren't buying it, and neither were the people who mattered most in William's life. His wife, standing in the corner of the room, looked like she'd been struck. The color had drained from her face, and her eyes were fixed on William, wide with disbelief. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice shaking. "William, the affairs, the money, is it true?" William took a step toward her, his hands outstretched in desperation. No, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like. I can explain." But she took a step back, shaking her head as tears welled up in her eyes. "You lied to me. This whole time, you've been lying to me." The tension in the room was unbearable now, and William could feel the walls closing in on him. He had always prided himself on being in control of his life, of his business, of the people around him. But now, he had no control over anything. Everything he had worked for, everything he thought he had secured, was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. One by one, the guests began to drift away, some making excuses to leave, others simply disappearing into the night without a word. The party, which had started as a celebration of William's success and power, had turned into a spectacle of his downfall. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose secrets had been laid bare for all to see. By the time the last of the guests had left, the once bustling mansion felt empty and cold. The lights still glowed softly, and the remnants of the extravagant party lingered, but the energy had shifted. What had once been a symbol of wealth and power now felt hollow, like the crumbling facade of a life built on lies. William stood alone in the grand foyer, staring at the spot where Mark had made his quiet, devastating exit. The humiliation, the shame. It clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. For years, he had seen himself as invincible, untouchable. He had built his empire on the backs of people like Mark, people he considered beneath him, and had never once thought they could rise up and turn the tables. But Mark had done just that. With a few carefully chosen words, he had exposed the truth and left William to face the consequences. Slowly, William sank into one of the plush chairs by the window, his hands running through his hair. His mind raced, trying to figure out what came next, how to salvage what was left. But the reality was sinking in. There might not be anything left to save. In a matter of minutes, his reputation, his standing in the community, and his family had all been put at risk. And the worst part was, deep down, he knew Mark had been right. He had underestimated the people he thought were beneath him. He had believed his wealth and power made him invincible. But now, as he sat in the empty mansion, he realized just how wrong he had been. For the first time in a long time, William Hartman felt powerless. Mark walked through the quiet streets of Beverly Hills, leaving the Hartman mansion behind him, the sounds of the party slowly fading into the distance, The night air was cool, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was strange, really, how something so heavy, years of enduring William's arrogance and cruelty, could lift so easily once the truth was spoken. He had never imagined himself in this position. For years, he had accepted his place in the background, tending to the gardens while people like William lived their glamorous lives. He had been the invisible man, the one nobody thought twice about. But tonight, he had stepped into the spotlight, and for the first time, he had let them all see him, really see him. Mark had always believed in keeping his head down, in doing his work and not making waves. He had accepted the taunts, the insults, because he thought that was just how life worked for people like him. But after tonight, he realized he had been wrong. He had power too, not the kind of power that came from money or status, but something deeper, something more enduring. He had the power of truth. As he walked, his thoughts wandered back to William. He imagined the man now, sitting in that grand mansion surrounded by the remnants of a party that had spiraled into disaster. Mark didn't feel sorry for him. William had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. But there was something else Mark felt, something more like pity. William had spent his entire life building an empire, yet he had no idea how fragile it all was. One gust of truth, and the whole thing came crashing down. Mark stopped for a moment at the edge of a park, looking out over the neatly manicured lawns that stretched out before him. It reminded him of the gardens he had worked so hard to maintain at the Hartman estate. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also a reflection of the man who owned them, meticulously curated, but hollow at the roots. There was something satisfying about walking away from it all, knowing that he had spoken his truth and that, for once, the world had listened. But as the night stretched on, Mark realized that he didn't need to think about William anymore. The victory wasn't about bringing a man like him down. It was about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his coworker, the one who had texted him before the party. How did it go? Mark smiled to himself, typing a quick response. Better than expected. It felt like an understatement, but Mark wasn't one for grand proclamations. He liked to keep things simple, and tonight had been simple in its own way. He had been given a chance to stand up, to say what needed to be said, and he had taken it. That was enough. As he continued walking, the streets grew quieter, the night deeper. He thought about what came next. His life wouldn't change overnight. There were still gardens to tend, still days to work. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt like the man who stood in the shadows. He had taken a step into the light, and that made all the difference. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the hills. Mark knew that by morning, the story of William Hartman's downfall would be all over the place. Beverly Hills thrived on scandal, and this one would be no exception. But Mark didn't care. He had no interest in watching William's slow unraveling, or in seeing how the rich and powerful dealt with the fallout. That was a world he had never belonged to, and after tonight, he knew he never wanted to. All that mattered now was that Mark had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had freed himself. The past no longer weighed him down. The future, whatever it held, was something he could face with his head held high. As Mark reached his modest apartment, he paused for a moment before stepping inside. He glanced up at the stars, breathing in the cool night air, the quiet, the peace. It felt like the perfect end to a night that had been anything but ordinary. With a final look at the night sky, Mark entered his apartment, closing the door behind him. A year passed quickly, though for William Hartman, it might as well have felt like a lifetime. The scandal surrounding his business dealings and personal betrayals spread like wildfire throughout Beverly Hills, and soon after that fateful party, everything began to unravel. His name, once synonymous with power and success, became a cautionary tale whispered about at other elite gatherings. Mark's, however, had quietly moved on. The events of that night had marked a turning point in his life, but he had no intention of lingering on the drama that followed. He continued his work, taking on more clients and expanding his gardening business. For him, the revelation wasn't about revenge. It was about finding his own sense of peace and dignity. And in the end, that's exactly what he got. But the real surprise came a few months later, when Mark received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer in a small town he barely remembered hearing about. Inside was a message that changed the course of his life once again. The letter explained that Mark had inherited a substantial fortune from a distant uncle he barely knew. The man had lived a quiet life in the countryside, far removed from the flashy lifestyle of Beverly Hills, and had quietly amassed a fortune through a series of smart investments. Upon his passing, with no children of his own, the inheritance was passed to Mark, his closest living relative. At first, Mark was stunned. He'd spent his whole life working hard, earning his keep, and never once had he imagined something like this happening to him. The idea of having more money than he'd ever dreamed of was overwhelming. But after the shock wore off, Mark realized something else. He had been given a rare opportunity to shape his future on his own terms. And so, with that fortune in hand, Mark made a decision that took even him by surprise. A few months later, the Hartman mansion was up for sale. With William's reputation in tatters and his finances in ruins, the once mighty millionaire had no choice but to liquidate his assets. The property was listed quietly at first, but soon word spread, and interested buyers began circling like vultures. Mark, with his newfound wealth, saw an opportunity. It wasn't about getting revenge or gloating over William's downfall. It was about closure. The mansion had been the site of so much pain and humiliation for Mark, but it was also where he had reclaimed his dignity, and now it would be his. The purchase went through smoothly, and before long, the Hartman estate was officially under new ownership. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. The once humble gardener now owned the very mansion where he had spent years working for a man who had treated him as nothing more than hired help. But for Mark, this was never about power. He wasn't interested in the lavish lifestyle that came with owning a mansion in Beverly Hills. To him, the estate was simply a place where he had found his strength, and owning it now felt like closing a chapter in his life. William, on the other hand, had reached his lowest point. Bankrupt, disgraced, and abandoned by nearly all of his former friends and colleagues. He had nowhere to turn. The world of luxury that he had built around himself had collapsed, leaving him with nothing but a hollow reminder of the man he once thought he was. It was during this time that William, broken and desperate, swallowed his pride and reached out to Mark. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. The man who had once humiliated Mark now stood at his door, hat in hand, asking for help. When Mark received the call from William, he was sitting in the garden, the very same garden he had tended for years. He listened to William's voice, now filled with desperation and humility, asking if there was any work he could do. The tables had turned completely, and William was now the one seeking a lifeline. Mark could have turned him away. He could have rejected him outright. But that wasn't who Mark was. He had spent his life working with his hands, understanding the value of patience, and above all, treating people with respect, even people like William. So after a long pause, Mark simply said, "Come by tomorrow. We'll find something for you to do." And with that, the next chapter of their story began. One where the roles were reversed, but the lessons of humility and forgiveness were more important than ever before. William stood at the edge of the once familiar Hartman estate, now looking at it with a strange mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. He had arrived early that morning, his worn-out shoes scraping the driveway that used to sparkle under the wheels of luxury cars. The grand mansion still loomed above him, unchanged, except for one thing. It no longer belonged to him. The weight of that truth was heavy as he made his way to the door, past the perfectly manicured gardens that, ironically, had always been Mark's pride. Now, they were a reminder of how the man he had once mocked now stood above him, not just figuratively, but literally. Mark owned this place now, and William was coming to him for work. The door opened before William had the chance to knock. Mark stood there, dressed simply in a faded button-down and jeans, looking as calm and composed as ever. There was no smugness in his expression, No hint of satisfaction at seeing William standing there, humbled and defeated. That, perhaps, stung William the most. He had expected Mark to gloat, to relish in the reversal of fortune. But Mark was simply Mark. "Come in," Mark said, his voice as steady as always. William stepped through the doorway, immediately struck by how different the house felt. It wasn't the mansion itself. Everything looked the same, down to the grand chandelier hanging in the foyer. But the air had shifted. The house no longer pulsed with the same self-importance it once had. It was quieter, more grounded, just like the man who now owned it. Mark led William to the sitting room, the same one where countless deals had been brokered, where William had entertained guests and held court over his empire. Now, it felt almost foreign. The lavish furniture remained, but the energy had changed, as if the room itself knew that the man who once ruled it had fallen from grace. "You said you were looking for work," Mark said, sitting down across from William. William hesitated. The words felt heavy in his throat, like admitting defeat out loud for the first time. "Yes," he finally managed, "I need work." Mark nodded thoughtfully, not pressing for more. He could have asked why William was in this position, could have made him explain the depths of his downfall. But Mark wasn't interested in further humiliating him. He had never been that kind of person. "I can offer you something here," Mark said after a moment. "The garden still needs regular care, and I'm looking for someone to help maintain it." William blinked. The garden? Of course. The same place where he had once watched Mark work for hours in the heat, trimming hedges and pruning flowers while he laughed with his friends inside. It seemed like a lifetime ago. And now, here he was, being offered the same job, a job he had always seen as beneath him. But William was no longer in a position to turn down such an offer. He had nothing left, no connections, no money, no prestige. The mansion, the cars, the lifestyle. It had all slipped through his fingers the moment his secrets were exposed, and as much as his pride fought against it, William knew that this was his only option. He nodded slowly, the weight of his decision sinking in. "I'll do it." Mark didn't gloat, didn't revel in the irony of the moment. Instead, he stood and gestured for William to follow him. "I'll show you what needs to be done." The two men walked outside, stepping into the garden that Mark had tended for years. The roses bloomed beautifully, the hedges were neatly trimmed, and the air smelled of fresh soil and flowers. It was a place of peace, something William had never fully appreciated until now. "This is the schedule," Mark explained as he handed William a small clipboard with the tasks for the week. "You'll need to prune the roses every few days, water the new plants, and make sure the hedges stay trimmed. I'll show you how it's done, but I expect you to pick it up quickly." William nodded, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of being in a subordinate position. He wasn't used to taking orders, least of all from Mark, but he wasn't in a position to argue. His once perfect life had crumbled around him, and this was all that remained, a simple job, in the garden of a mansion that no longer belonged to him. Mark spent the next few hours walking William through the tasks, showing him how to care for the plants, how to prune them properly, how to handle the tools with care. It was strange, standing there side by side, the roles so drastically reversed. But Mark treated William with the same quiet respect that he had always shown, never once rubbing his victory in. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, William had finished his first day as a gardener. His hands, once soft from years of pushing pens and shaking hands in business meetings, were now dirty and blistered from handling the tools. The work was harder than he'd imagined, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long while, William felt something strange, a flicker of humility. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, William looked over at Mark, who was quietly watering the flowers nearby. The resentment he'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, there was a sense of acceptance. This was his reality now, and perhaps, for the first time, that wasn't such a terrible thing. Days turned into weeks, and the routine became something almost surreal for William. Each morning he arrived at the Hartman estate, the estate that had once been his, to tend the gardens. The man who had once ordered people around without a second thought was now following instructions, trimming hedges, pruning roses, and making sure every plant was in perfect shape. At first, it was unbearable. William had always been someone who thrived on power, on being the one in control. The idea of working for someone, especially someone like Mark, felt like a punishment. It was humiliating, knowing that he had fallen so far. But as the days passed, something shifted inside him. The work, though hard, was honest. There was something satisfying about seeing the immediate results of his efforts, something pure about working with his hands. The world of deals and deceit that William had once lived in seemed so far away now, like a distant memory. Here, in the garden, everything was straightforward. You put in the effort, and the garden rewarded you with beauty. Mark rarely spoke about the past. He never mentioned the humiliation William had subjected him to, never brought up the night of the party when everything had come crashing down. Instead, Mark treated William with the same quiet respect he gave to everyone. There were no snide remarks, no reminders of William's fall from grace, just the work, the garden, and the peaceful quiet that came with it. One morning, as William was carefully pruning a particularly tricky set of rose bushes, Mark approached him, carrying a watering can. He set it down nearby and watched William for a moment before speaking. "You're getting better at this," Mark said, his tone casual. William glanced up, a bead of sweat running down his forehead. "I guess practice helps." Mark nodded, kneeling down to inspect the work William had done. "You've got a good eye for it. These bushes haven't looked this good in a while." The compliment was unexpected, and William wasn't sure how to respond. For so long, his sense of worth had been tied to his wealth, his success. But now, standing here with dirt on his hands, hearing praise for something as simple as trimming a bush, he felt something new, a quiet sense of pride. "Thanks," William said after a pause, his voice softer than usual. It was a small word, but it carried weight. He hadn't expected to find himself here, but there was a strange sense of peace that came with it. Mark didn't say anything else for a moment, just continued to work beside him, silently tending to the plants. It was like this most days, the two men working side by side in the garden, no words needed. There was a sense of understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that things had changed, and that maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. As the morning wore on, William found himself thinking about how different his life had become in such a short time. A year ago, he had been at the top, untouchable in his own eyes. He had the money, the power, the reputation, everything that made him feel important. And yet, in the end, none of it had mattered. All the wealth in the world hadn't saved him from his own arrogance. Mark, on the other hand, had something William had never truly appreciated: humility. It wasn't weakness, as William had once thought. It was strength, the kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops or flaunted with fancy cars and expensive suits. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew who he was and didn't need validation from anyone else. As they continued to work, Mark finally broke the silence. "You know," he began, "when I first started working here, I never thought I'd end up where I am now." William paused, curious. "What do you mean?" Mark wiped his hands on his jeans, glancing around the garden. "I didn't come from much. Never really thought I'd be in a position like this, owning a place like this. It always seemed like something out of reach. But life's funny that way. You never really know where you'll end up." William nodded, understanding that truth all too well. He had once been the man who believed he was invincible, that the world bent to his will. But life had shown him differently. "It's strange," William admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I always thought having all that power made me better than everyone else. But now, I don't know. I feel like I'm seeing things clearly for the first time." Mark looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his words. "Power's a tricky thing," he said finally. "It can blind you if you're not careful, but it doesn't have to define you." William looked down at his hands, now calloused from weeks of working in the garden. They were no longer the hands of a businessman, but of a man who had learned to work the earth. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once lorded over others was now learning the value of humility and hard work. "I guess you're right," William said, a small, almost sad smile tugging at his lips. "It's just hard to accept sometimes." Mark gave a slight nod, his expression understanding. "It takes time, but we all get there eventually." The conversation drifted into silence again, but the air between them felt different now. There was a sense of mutual respect, an acknowledgement of the journey both men had been on. They had started from opposite ends, but somehow they had met in the middle, each learning something from the other. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, Mark stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. "You did good work today, William. Keep it up." William looked at him, the words settling over him like a balm. "Thanks," he said, meaning it this time. And for the first time in years, William felt like he was finally on the right path. The months that followed brought a sense of routine and quiet normalcy to the estate, something William never thought he'd appreciate. He had once thrived in the fast-paced world of high-stakes deals and social gatherings, but now there was a peaceful rhythm to his life that he had come to embrace. Each day in the garden felt like a small victory, a chance to breathe, to reflect, and to let go of the man he used to be. Mark and William continued working side by side, though their roles had settled into something that felt more like an equal partnership than employer and employee. The garden had become their shared project, something they both took pride in. William, once known for controlling everything in his life, had learned to appreciate the simplicity of letting the plants grow in their own time, without forcing anything. The work was hard, but it had a way of grounding him. He often thought about how different his life was now compared to the man he had been a year ago. Back then, he had been someone who lived for wealth and status, someone who believed he was invincible. But life had stripped him of those illusions, and in the process, had given him something far more valuable: perspective. One day, as the two men worked together under the warm afternoon sun, Mark paused and looked over at William, who was carefully pruning the roses. "You've come a long way," Mark said, not unkindly. William looked up, his hands still holding the shears. There was a quiet pride in Mark's voice, and it caught William off guard. He hadn't thought much about it, but Mark was right. The man he had become wasn't the same one who had looked down on Mark a year ago. He was different, and it wasn't just the physical work that had changed him. "Yeah," William replied, his voice softer than usual. "I guess I have." Mark smiled, nodding toward the neat rows of flowers they had been tending. "The garden shows it. It's thriving." William looked at the garden, seeing it in a new light. The same space that had once represented his dominance now felt like a reflection of something else entirely: growth, humility, and a sense of connection. It was no longer a symbol of power, but of care and attention, of learning to nurture instead of control. Mark set down his tools and leaned against a tree, taking a moment to appreciate the tranquility around them. "You know, William, I never thought I'd be standing here with you like this." William chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither did I." The two men shared a quiet moment of understanding, the unspoken history between them hanging in the air, but no longer heavy with resentment or bitterness. It had transformed into something lighter, something that no longer had the power to hold either of them back. After a few moments of silence, William turned to Mark, his face thoughtful. "You didn't have to do any of this, you know. Let me work here. Give me a chance after everything I did." Mark shrugged, his usual calm demeanor steady as ever. "Maybe. But we all make mistakes, William. It's what we do after that matters." William considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I'm still figuring that part out." Mark smiled, his eyes kind. "You're on the right track." It was a simple exchange, but it held a depth that both men understood. William had once believed that his worth came from his wealth, his power over others. But now, standing in the garden with Mark, he realized that real value came from something much deeper. It wasn't about what he had or what he could control. It was about who he was becoming. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the estate, Mark pushed himself off the tree and picked up his tools. "We've done enough for today. Let's call it." William nodded, setting down the shears and wiping his hands on his jeans. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the city seemed distant, almost like a world away. The garden, lush and vibrant, was proof of the work they had done together. And in a way, it was also a testament to the journey they had both been on. Before they headed inside, William paused, looking around the estate. It no longer felt like a place of loss or humiliation. Instead, it felt like a place of renewal, for the garden, for Mark, and for himself. As they walked toward the house, William felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. The fall from grace, the loss of his fortune and reputation, none of it mattered as much anymore. He had found something far more important in its place, the ability to start over. When they reached the house, Mark turned to William one last time before heading inside. "You know, William, this place feels different with you here." William smiled, a real smile this time. "It feels different for me, too." Mark nodded, satisfied with that answer. "See you tomorrow, then?" "Yeah," William replied, his voice steady. "Tomorrow." As Mark disappeared into the house, William stood outside for a moment longer, taking in the view of the garden one last time. The flowers, the trees, the neatly trimmed hedges, they were a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. But for the first time in a long time, William felt ready for whatever came next.